Hello and welcome to the Westminster Institute. I'm Robert Riley, its director. Today we're delighted to welcome back to the Westminster Institute Dean Cheng, one of the foremost scholars on China. Now, the first show we did with Dean Cheng was 3 years ago, and I'll give you the topic of it: how China views the world and the return of the Middle Kingdom. It's an excellent presentation, and I invite you to go into the Westminster Institute's archives, or what you will, and that excellent presentation is still posted. Now, about 2 years ago, we did a show with Dean, the Chinese-Russian relationship. It's complicated. And in a way, we'll be touching on some of the same subjects that Dean covered there, but within the past 2 years, a number of things have happened. And what we're trying to concentrate on today is what is the foundation of this glowing relationship between President Xi of China and President Putin of Russia. What is in terms of their long-term strategic interests, where do those strategic interests intersect, and how large is that intersection, and what might unravel this bromance because those strategic interests cannot be aligned. And Dean is so familiar with Chinese history, he can tell us in past history when it didn't align and the relationship was very fractious. I'll just refresh your memories as to who Dean Cheng is. Now he's a senior advisor to the China program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Before that, Dean spent more than a decade at the Heritage Foundation, where he was a senior fellow in China Studies. So for 10 years at the Heritage Foundation. Before that, Mr. Cheng worked at Science Applications International Corporation and the China Studies Division of the Center of Naval Analyses, a federally funded research institute, and he also served as an analyst of the International Security and Space Program at the Office of Technology Assessment, a congressionally chartered agency with particular expertise on the Chinese defense industry. He's fluent in Mandarin and uses Mandarin language materials regularly, goes to the sources and writes from them. And he was a senior analyst with the China Studies Division at the Center for Naval Analyses from 2001 to 2009. Before joining CNA, he was a senior analyst with the Science Applications International Corporation. Mentioned that before. He has also served as an analyst with the U.S. Congress's Office of Technology Assessment in the International Security and Space Division, where he studied Chinese defense industrial complex. He has written many articles for the premier magazines dealing with foreign policy and others. Dean has made many television appearances, and especially important, Dean has been a witness in congressional hearings quite frequently, and that's both in front of Senate committees and in front of House of Representatives committees. He's also written many articles, many book chapters. He has a book titled Cyber Inside China's Information Warfare and Cyber Operations. Well, welcome Dean back, and today we're going to discuss the topic I alluded to earlier. What are the foundations of what seems to be a growing? How solid are those foundations in terms of each country's strategic interest? on which they can rely for some period of time until all such arrangements unravel because they no longer rely.
Well, I think that one of the funny things when we think about the Sino-Russian relationship is how much it's almost a bipolar distribution. You have people who are very optimistic, and you have people who are very pessimistic. The optimists in the West who look at this say, this can't possibly last. The Chinese and the Russians, they haven't liked each other for centuries. Therefore, this relationship is only temporary, and we just have to stick it out briefly. The pessimists think here we have a pair of authoritarian governments, both of whom seem pretty committed to overturning the current rules-based international order. To borrow a phrase, they wish to make the world safe for autocracy. I think both of those, frankly, are off base. I think what we are seeing is two countries who have shared antipathies towards the United States, towards the West, towards aspects of the rules-based international order, but they have few mutual sympathies. They don't see eye to eye on themselves on a number of things. At a basic level, the Russians seem to almost revel in chaos. They support left-wing groups, right-wing groups, anarchist groups. They mostly want to disrupt.
Not at home, obviously.
Not at home, obviously, but in other countries and throughout the international order. The Chinese want order. They want rules. The fundamental challenge for them is a rules-based international order where they have written the rules. And here, both Russia and China don't like the current system. Both agree that the United States has too much power. Both see the United States and the democratic West as posing a fundamental challenge to the rule of Putin and the rule of Xi. But there are inherent contradictions in this, beginning with the fundamental power relationship. Russia has gone from being the foremost power when it was the Soviet Union to being much more the weaker power. The war in Ukraine has really, between the sanctions as a response, international opprobrium, Russia today is politically in a much weaker position, certainly relative to China, which is the number 2 GDP in the world, technologically far more sophisticated, and is a country that others are far more leery about antagonizing. Trying to impose sanctions on China is a very different proposition than imposing sanctions on Russia. So we see already the seeds of long-term, but here we are talking very long-term, multi-decade, frictions in the Sino-Russian relationship.
Let me ask you the question, had it not been for the war in Ukraine, had Putin decided not to invade, and had Zelensky, as it seemed he was prepared to do after the first week of that war, to say, wait a minute, I will guarantee you that Ukraine will not join NATO, which Vladimir Putin always presented as the premier antagonism between the two of them. All right, so we're saying no Ukraine war, meaning Russia would not be in such a totally dependent situation regarding China, because he would have other places to go. But because of the war, there was nowhere else to go except China. So absent the war, he wouldn't be as dependent. And do you think there would have been a bromance if that had not been the case?
I think that Vladimir Putin is antagonistic towards the West. Ukraine provided a focal point, but even before the Ukraine war, going back to, say, 2014, we saw him meddling in European affairs. We saw him creating tensions. The whole business in Syria, where, ironically enough, Wagner mercenaries challenged American forces, was before the Ukraine war broke out.
It was at the same time, however, in which Russia seized Crimea.
Right. So But before that, we also had the Georgia conflict. So
Right.
Russia has been chafing at the Western international order. And in that regard, he was going to be looking for partners that would join him in challenging. Xi Jinping has been a very different Chinese leader than his predecessors, certainly than Deng Xiaoping, than Jiang Zemin, than Hu Jintao. He has been much more confrontational. He has been much more willing to take the lead, something Deng Xiaoping admonished against. So I think you would have seen a closing of relations, improvement of relations. There are certain natural alignments as well. Russia, because of Putin's poor choices since taking office, long before the Ukraine war, in terms of investment, in terms of where he has prioritized national efforts, Russia really is a commodities-oriented exporter. It exports food, it exports oil, it exports certain minerals, and it exports weapons. That's about the only finished product that there is a significant market for.
As usual.
As usual, much like the Soviet Union. It also exports gold. China wants oil, wants food, is happy to import gold, and in some respects is interested in Russian weaponry. So there's a natural relationship there that has been enhanced by all of the sanctions. But even if there had been no Ukraine war, and we can wind that back all the way to even if the Russians hadn't tried to take Crimea back in 2014, I think that you would have seen a closer relationship between Moscow and Beijing.
Well, that's so. It was pretty much in the cards either way.
I think so long as Putin and Xi are in charge, you have two leaders who look at each other as fairly natural co-conspirators in challenging the Western international order. Not friends, not allies, but very limited partners.
Very limited partners who nonetheless share these characteristics, I think you might agree. They are both anti-status quo powers. They are both driven by grievances, different ones, of course. For Xi, it's the century of humiliation. So what had been this great power, the Middle Kingdom, was humiliated in a profound way for a long period of time, which created a huge amount of domestic tumult. Xi is also animated by grievances because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and what he takes as the antipathy of the West. Even when the West went into Russia to try to help it through this period, its import was poisoned because it contained these democratic values and institutions that they were encouraging. So he wants some kind of restoration. As you pointed out, Xi is animated by grievance, and he's much more open about it. He, by the way, as you have pointed out, I think in our original show together, that even Xi has said the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, as if he had been reading President Putin's notes, who of course said the same thing. And I know he was preoccupied at first when he came into power that a similar collapse would not take place in China as it had in Russia. And I think he needed to strengthen the party and its structures. And the interesting thing to me is he did it with Marxism-Leninism and loyalty to this ideology, which Putin doesn't seem to have maintained in a public way, despite his authoritarian behavior. It's obviously a much freer place than it had been.
One of the key things that you've hit on is the issue of grievance. And I think that when we look at Russia, when we look at China, when we look at Iran, we see here in each case great empires that have fallen. And so what we have here in each case is what one might term revanche. Not revenge, but a desire to return to past glory. Whether it is the Persians in the form of the Iranians, who for the longest time were the dominant power in their part of the world, whether it is Russia, whether Imperial Russia or the Soviet Union, and of course China with 5,000 years of history. In each case, I think each feels that it has been laid low by these newcomer slash annoyances of the West, marked by democracy, marked by capitalism, marked by freedom of thought, which has in turn led to innovation. And each wishes to see a return back to their rightful, in their view, their rightful place of being, as you say, the dominant power in their neighborhood. The one interesting element here, however, is I think that, at least in the case of the Chinese, they would argue that they are in fact very much status quo powers. The question here is, who's status quo? And in the case of the Chinese, they look at a status quo rooted in 5,000 years of history where they are the dominant power in East Asia throughout this period, with the interesting exception of that last 100 years, the century of humiliation. China was always the middle kingdom, Zhongguo, or the central kingdom. Zhongguo can be translated as either middle kingdom or central kingdom. It was surrounded by states that gave deference, that paid tribute, tributary states. So that's a very different starting point, a very different perception of what the status quo should be. And of course, you have that century of humiliation from 1842 to 1949, or 1839 to 1949, beginning with the First Opium War, ranging through several wars, all of which China lost, and ending with the founding of the People's Republic of China. And here you have a period when China really lost control of its own destiny. And certainly was not the dominant power in the region. So that's the fall and now the return. But it does seek, I think, to return to a status quo. Now, from our perception, that is overturning our status quo. And the problem there is that our status quo mostly overlaps with the period of greatest Chinese weakness. So it's not that our status quo must be that China is weak, although I think some Chinese perceive it that way, but that our status quo is at base contradictory to China's status quo. And we see this in the reality that we have many, many friends, allies, partners throughout East Asia, all of whom we believe should be able to chart their own course. Many of these countries were, in longer ago history, tributary states to China. And from China's perception, that is their proper place. So right there you have a fundamental contradiction.
And that's what worries some of the adjacent states like Japan and the Philippines and Malaysia, etc. Well, the Chinese don't seem to be reluctant to use force to recover the status quo as they understand it.
Yes and no. They, on the one hand, to be fair to the Chinese, they have not fought a war since 1979. So they are somewhat less war-prone than we've been. On the other hand, they are very good at using the full range of instruments of national power, economic power, diplomatic power, public opinion, social media, to really pressure their neighbors, up to and including shows of force, whether it is constant intrusions into Taiwanese airspace, or as we've been hearing about in the South China Sea for the last several weeks, open interference with efforts to resupply the small Philippine outpost at Second Thomas Shoal.
Right. Well, I mean, the one thing that is so notable about China is its modernization and buildup in their military, which some say is the largest, fastest buildup of any great power in history. They certainly lap the United States in that. We have only, for instance, 2 naval harbors that are capable of building ships. The goal is to create 2 new submarines a year. Our industry is incapable of meeting that goal. Meanwhile, I believe China has something like 11 naval yards, and we know they're churning out major modernized navy that, at least in sheer numbers, eclipses the United States. And now, because of the United States' relationship with Taiwan, they obviously have to do one of 2 things: have such an overwhelming military power, which, as you pointed out before, is only one element of the conflict or the contentious issue. They will use everything. They will achieve information dominance, which they think is the key in reaching military objectives, not just the military. And to show the United States that if they go to war in the South China Sea, they're going to lose it. And that looks very much like the situation now, which makes many people very nervous. If the United States understands that, it will withdraw its help from Taiwan, which is, if it does that, that's a major downgrade in U.S. military power. And the success to which the Chinese are devoted. They don't want to fight that war. They want to get the results of victory without war. Their military, of course, is untested in actual combat, but nonetheless, it is impressive. So people, you can say what you have about the reluctance to use force on the part of China, but the single most notable thing over the past 20 years is this historical, immense military buildup, which has to raise the question, what's this for?
Well, I think that the Chinese military's buildup, which, as you note, is enormous by any and every metric, is incredibly comprehensive. It is not simply the tip of the spear, combat forces. It also includes combat support and combat service support, and that's very important because that means it's a sustainable military. It's a military that is not simply one good Sunday punch in the hope that it will knock down the opponent. It is one that can sustain conflict, and we see this in the proliferation of everything from airborne early warning aircraft to electronic warfare capabilities to underway replenishment ships to modernized logistics. We see this with regards to improvements in command and control and sensors and all the rest. So what is this for? To be fair to China, one purpose of a large modern military is an insurance policy. It's the reason why every modern large nation has a significant military. You have a large economy. It is at least partly to very dependent on trade. You need to be able to protect the nation and its resources. So every military is, to some extent, an insurance policy. And the wealthier you are, the more insurance you presumably have. But in the case of the PRC, the military also serves 2 other purposes. Above all, to keep the party in power. And so there is an internal security element, much more in the role of the People's Armed Police and internal security forces, but the People's Liberation Army is a party army. It is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. And therefore, its first and foremost mission actually is not national security, it is keeping the party in power. And as we saw in Tiananmen back in 1989, and we have ample evidence that the PLA itself is indoctrinated in this, if and when the party demands it, the military will roll to support the party and to keep it in power. The other element here is to secure what the Chinese term territorial integrity and national sovereignty. And that means protecting what the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has claimed to be Chinese territory. What are we talking about? Well, Taiwan is the most obvious one. That's the focal point. That's what everyone's talking about. But the South China Sea. the Senkakus, 4 small islands northeast of Taiwan. That is the point of a territorial dispute between China and Japan. There's territorial disputes along the Sino-Indian border. And very worrisome there, we have actually seen people die in fighting at the top of the world, literally, in the Himalayas. The PLA can be called out to suppress dissidents such as Uyghurs in Xinjiang. What we are also starting to see is a PLA that goes farther afield. So we have a military base in Djibouti. We've heard discussions of China establishing military bases in Africa. There is a small military facility, security facility, in one of the Central Asian republics. So we are slowly seeing the Chinese becoming more assertive, more of a presence abroad. A third piece, which is less publicly discussed, is that of deterrence, which is to say that before it gets to fighting, the PLA hopes to intimidate who? It hopes to intimidate Taiwan, to make sure that Taiwan does not declare independence, and ideally that Taiwan will, of its own free will, rejoin China. China's neighbors, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Thailand, Vietnam, all of these countries, India, to make sure that none of these countries feel like they can challenge China, whether it's on territory or trade or other issues. And finally, the grand prize, the United States. To deter the United States from aiding Taiwan, to deter the United States from conducting freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Straits, and, should it come down to it, to deter the United States from actively operating west of Guam in any kind of contingency. Korea, Sino-Indian borders, South China Sea, Taiwan, etc. To do that, you need a very large, very modern military, one that can absorb losses and keep on fighting. And that goes to what you had mentioned earlier about shipyards, but also aircraft factories, munitions factories, and all the rest. We are facing real challenges supplying Ukraine with 155 millimeter artillery shells, which are not smart shells. These are basic, artillery shells that our grandfathers would remember from World War I. We're having trouble producing those. China has hot production lines. It has hot production lines for modern surface combatants. It has hot production lines for UAVs and fighter jets and all the rest. And that in and of itself can be a deterrent factor without firing a single shot.
Particularly in light of the fact that the United States does not have those production lines, and that it will take many years to replace some of the weapons which the United States has given to Ukraine. We're down to one line producing some of those essential weapons in our inventory, which means not only won't we have them in the quantity in which is necessary for our national security, but we won't be supplying our allies who have ordered those very same weapons, which includes, of course, Taiwan. Yes. Sorry, we'll maybe get to you in 10 years. This is among the supposed benefits of winning the Cold War. We don't have any enemies. What do we need these military production lines for? As you know, we used to be very good at that. When there was a great national consensus, everyone rowing in the same direction, the incredible production of war material, which I have the statistics for, which are simply mind-boggling. A new aircraft carrier every week, an incredible amount of fighter aircraft and bombers, of tanks, etc. All that, the production lines and Ford Motor and others that could be adjusted to meeting these needs was done in such a short order. It was staggering. Now, I have no doubt that the American business world could do this again if indeed there's an interest in having it done. When you're out of ammunition, you're very interested, of course. And the United States major political figures seem to be aware of this, talking about it, and made a major statement about China in his State of the Union speech, that we are in a perilous condition comparable to pre-World War II, when at least Roosevelt got the idea that something very bad was coming and got the production lines going to produce material for, well, Great Britain at that time, but also to rearm the United States. China knows about this, and I think they're interested in doing what they can to discourage the United States from the military buildup it would need to sort of obviate the margin of superiority that China now enjoys. That's a very big order, that China wants to remove the United States as a Pacific power. I mean, well, you know, you go west of Guam, you're out of the area. And the area is very important to the United States and the rest of the world. Freedom of navigation is essential, the amount of trade that goes through the Taiwan Straits. The Chinese know how valuable Taiwan is just in that respect. And if they gain control of it, then they can break out and be supported by the militarized shoals that they have built up and created throughout the South China Sea, and now they're pushing into the East China Sea. What might trigger a conflict? Because the United States doesn't want to be thrown out of Asia. When might there be, what the conflict could be the result of an error, or it could be the result of the understanding that we fight now or will be weaker later. And if such a conflict occurs, how does Russia behave in light of it? As you've pointed out, Russia and China are not in an alliance, a military alliance. They have other ways of supporting each other, which are major and very important.
Well, the good news here is that the U.S. and China don't confront each other directly. That is, there is no U.S. territory that China claims. There's no Chinese territory that the U.S. claims. So we should be grateful for small favors. But, what could precipitate a conflict? There's at least 3 or 4 areas that are pretty almost canonical. The first one, of course, is Taiwan. We do not have an alliance with Taiwan. We do not even diplomatically recognize Taiwan. This is actually rather awkward. But under the Taiwan Relations Act, we have said that we will provide Taiwan with the wherewithal to defend itself, and that while the U.S. takes no position on the ultimate resolution of the Taiwan Straits, we want it to be. 4 times has said we will come to the aid of Taiwan, point blank. Each time his staff has then walked that back, which I think has left everyone rather confused about exactly where we stand. But the point here is that if you are China, you understand that a key variable here is what will the American position be in the event the Chinese decide to act. A second area related is the South China Sea. As China acts against the Philippines, a U.S. treaty partner, in the Spratly Islands, which is outside of the treaty, it is not clear, again, how the U.S. will respond. And it's one of the reasons why, again, the Chinese are calibrating their actions. They have not used force, but they have deliberately interfered with resupply efforts. They have rammed ships. They have apparently stolen Philippine Zodiacs, rigid-hulled inflatables. But they haven't shot anyone, and that's an important consideration.
They have killed someone, however.
Yes, they have. And that is, we are in very, very dangerous territory there. I mentioned the Senkakus because there the U.S. position has been that while we do not take a position on sovereignty over the Senkakus, we believe that those areas under the administrative control of Japan is covered by the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty, which means that if the Chinese act against those territories, war against Japanese Coast Guard or Japanese Naval Maritime Self-Defense Force vessels operating in those areas, that could precipitate a conflict. And finally, there are a couple of less thought about situations.
May I just point out
Yep.
that the Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and the Philippines obliges us to come to their defense.
It obliges us to come to their defense if there is interference or destruction of a Philippine vessel, meaning government, which includes aircraft. Contractors seem to fall into a gray region. The U.S. Congress, in its debate over ratifying the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty, specifically excluded the Spratlys, but not from the obligation of supporting an event of interference of a Philippine government vessel. The Philippines has long argued that the treaty actually covers the Spratlys per se, and that has always been a major point of contention between Manila and Washington. So, as you can see, before we go and confront the Chinese, we need to have our own side sort of decide what is specifically covered here. What we see in outer space and what we see in the cyber realm are significant new zones of conflict. What would happen if the Chinese interfered with our satellites? Our satellites are absolutely vital for our ability to prosecute a war. The cyber interference, cyber intrusion, cyber attack, the U.S. government recently, along with cybersecurity firms, released information about something called Volta Typhoon. It is cyber mine laying, essentially, that we have identified groups that have apparently pre-installed potential destructive programs into critical infrastructure, water, power, communications. The general sense is that this is the PRC that's done this. We would not countenance a country coming over and bombing Hoover Dam or bombing a nuclear power plant. How should we view somebody who has laid cyber bombs into that same critical infrastructure? So how could a conflict arise? Here are a bunch of potential areas that could precipitate a conflict. What would Russia do? I think what is interesting when we think about the Russia-Ukraine war is how carefully the Chinese have calibrated their response. We see no evidence that China has provided weapons, Su-27 fighter jets, Type 99 main battle tanks, 054 Zhangkai class frigates. It doesn't seem to be much evidence at this time that China has provided munitions. North Korea, recent reports indicate, has provided 1.6 million artillery shells. No one seems to be accusing China at this point of providing artillery shells, air-to-air missiles, surface-to-air missiles. What China has been willing to provide is dual-use technology, including microchips. The microchips that they are sending, they say, are dual-use for refrigerators and coffee pots and all the rest, but they seem to be appearing in Russian UAVs and Russian-guided missiles. But above all, what China is providing is the same absolutely vital resource that the United States supplied Great Britain from 1914 to 1917 and from 1939 to 1941, which is money. Money is how you actually fight a war. And if you look throughout history, the side that with the bigger armies, good place to bet. The side with the bigger bank account definitely can sustain the war longer. And China has been willing to provide Russia with money by buying their food, by buying their oil, by continuing to make investments, by allowing the use of Chinese banks and credit cards and other assets. So I think what Russia would do in the event of a conflict is to return the favor. It's not going to provide money, but it can certainly provide food, it can provide energy, it could do so at a potentially lower cost. It could provide certain technology. not microchips per se, but say blueprints for the S-400, blueprints for better fighter jets, blueprints for better engines. China still has trouble making enough fighter turbofans, those sorts of capabilities. And in certain areas where Russia simply has more experience. At the end of the day, Russia has been operating spacecraft longer. Russia has a better understanding of space surveillance because it has a larger continent-sized footprint upon which to do these sorts of things. Russia has been collecting intelligence on everyone and everything for decades. It could choose to share those files. So I suspect that before we would ever imagine seeing a Russian expeditionary force appearing with tanks and troops, you will see Russia providing China with a lot of blueprints, a lot of food to sustain the national economy, a lot of oil to sustain the national war effort.
China probably has already many of those blueprints from its espionage activities.
And that's one of the great ironies, is that Russia, until recently, actually was very reluctant to share certain technologies with China, because China did not respect Russian intellectual property any more than respected Western intellectual property. But as the Russian situation has become more constricted, it has found itself compelled to engage in arms sales to China, knowing full well that in about 5 years, many of those products will be on sale cheaper, probably more reliable, on the open market, competing with Sukhoi and Ilyushin and the Mil helicopters.
Dean, you mentioned one really fascinating subject, and that is the use of cyber. And a couple of years ago, there was a big problem in the Northeast when there was a cyber attack, and they shut down the pumps for the gas pipeline, the natural gas, and so all those people were without energy. And it showed how easily that could be done. And I know China would be interested in creating chaos in the United States if the prospect of war becomes immediate. Of course, doing this is an act of war, but as you also indicated, there's always this plausible deniability. We didn't do it. Prove there's PLA involvement, and we'll talk. And our infrastructure is so vulnerable. That weakness has been pointed out endlessly at congressional hearings, and it hasn't resulted in any significant hardening of those infrastructure locations.
Yes, unfortunately, cybersecurity at the end of the day is overhead. If you are a power generating company, if you are a car manufacturer, if you're a computer manufacturer, cybersecurity, it works alongside the janitorial staff and the people who do payroll, and they are not a profit center. Now, if you're a cybersecurity firm, they're a profit center. But trying to persuade corporate, the C-suite, that cybersecurity ranks up there with producing the better widget per se, is very hard, and no one is going to scream and yell about it until someone does something bad, and then all of a sudden you're patching and you're applying band-aids, and then you wait for the next crisis. Certain sectors do understand that their corporate bottom line is tied to cybersecurity. The financial sector, for example, does understand all you need is one bad hack and your reputation is gone, and nobody will put their money in your bank.
How about the public sector?
The public sector, every year, I can't remember which of the computer magazines publishes the top 50 passwords. Because they're exactly what you would expect them to be. Password 123. password with a capital P. QWERTY, QWERTY, the first 5 keys in the upper left hand of the keyboard. Year after year, this goes on. Year after year, they do surveys of, have you installed antivirus and anti-malware software on your computer? The number of people who don't even know if they have is appalling. Then the question is, when was the last time you had it updated? Number of people who have no idea if they've even updated it or not, or if it's expired. That is a huge vulnerability. That is a huge vulnerability in terms of the sheer number of computers that are susceptible to being formed into botnets, for example. We have stories of companies who outsource their IT security. I can't remember which company it was, or it might have been a government agency, where the person in charge of it had actually hired someone from China to do the updates and things like that. Well, it was the lowest bidder. So do people take this seriously? People who do this for a living do. I think the IT departments of everyone from Con Ed to General Motors takes it seriously. But do the executives where does Monsanto, where does Con Ed, where does Dominion Electric put their marginal dollar? Do they put it into IT security, or do they put it into modernizing pumps? Or do they put it into environmental protection? That's what you're talking about, is the competition for that marginal dollar. And it is by no means clear that, well, of course IT should get that first dollar and the second dollar.
Yeah, it's distressing how vulnerable we are in that area. Turn off the water pumps and people will get very thirsty very quickly.
Yes.
And very desperate. So that's a new angle. And I know the Chinese have that clearly in mind. You mentioned that Russia is very good at creating chaos and interfering in other nations. The chaos is to their interest because the nation is so divided it can't act. And we know they're active in the United States preparing for such a thing. But so are the Chinese.
Yes.
They've done their homework. They're very good at this.
Both Russia and China have a much more holistic view of conflict. We begin from the assumption that peace is the default and war is the exception. And when we say war, we tend to have in our minds most often images from World War II, maybe from Vietnam and from the Gulf Wars, etc. B-2s and B-52s and M1s and Shermans and Iowa-class battleships and Arleigh-Burke-class destroyers. War is violence, but it's institutionalized violence with uniforms. And I think when you look at the Chinese and you look at the Russians, they see conflict as clashes of societies, that undermining the societal support, not simply through bombing and cruise missiles and the like, but societal disruption, sowing chaos, sowing anger and distrust, weakening economics, all of that is part of the conflict and are tools of conflict. And that victory isn't marching into the enemy capital and forcing them to sign a peace treaty. That's lovely if you can do it. But it is a matter of having the other side perhaps so disrupted that they can't even get their act together to fight you. So there's no one to even think about declaring a war and eventually getting to a peace treaty, but just miring them down in their own internal frictions. I think both Russia and China operate along those lines when it comes to thinking about conceptualizing conflict. I think that's one of the reasons why both countries have a concept of cognitive warfare, which occurs alongside more traditional kinetic warfare.
I remember this is now some years ago. It wasn't China's defense minister, but it was a senior general speaking at a conference I forget what the location of it was, whether it was in Singapore or Malaysia. In the discussion period, the representative of one of those countries got up and complained about China's activities in the South China Sea, and the general simply looked at him and said, "We're a big country and you're a small country. Live with that reality, so you're not in a position to oppose us." What I find interesting about Xi is his background, the eminence of his father, the overthrow of his father, eventual reinstatement, Xi's own experience of being sent to the country. Yet he seems to have evolved into a doctrinaire Marxist-Leninist and has resumed a rigorous education campaign in the principles of that party. So he doesn't seem to have as much leeway as Deng Xiaoping and some of the others. And you pointed out the statement back then is keep a low profile, build your power, and be deceptive about how great your power has become. That's obviously over. And Xi seems to have been successful in antagonizing many of China's neighbors, the Philippines, India, Malaysia, Vietnam, countries which they would prefer to have as tributaries, but who are anxious to work together because many small countries can succeed against a large country if there's some kind of mutual interest that they can pursue. That China would have a lot more to have to deal with than just the United States, which would complicate the picture for them in a major way. Do you think that's an exaggeration? That should a conflict arise, they wouldn't do anything about it because they're small countries and China's a big one?
I think that first off, when we look across Asian history, there is no history of balance of power politics. I think this is an enormously important point that Americans do not seem to understand. Our concept of foreign policy is rooted in European history. Every time a hegemon has risen, Napoleon, Hitler, the Kaiser, the Soviet Union, there was forged a coalition that opposed and brought down that hegemon. That is our default concept of international relations. Asia has no such history. We have never seen an intra-Asian alliance to counter China ever. Second is, I think China is accustomed to dealing with countries bilaterally, and Asia, unfortunately, is also accustomed to dealing with China on a bilateral basis. People talk about ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. ASEAN is many things, but it is not an alliance. To begin with, there's no military mechanism there. In fact, we are a big country, you're a small country, occurred at the ASEAN Regional Forum. That was the Chinese foreign State Counselor for Foreign Affairs, Yang Jiechi, said that, looking at the Singaporeans. And he said exactly that. There are big countries and there are small countries, and that is simply the reality. What we do not see, even in the South China Sea with the territorial disputes, who are parties to the Spratlys dispute? China, Malaysia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Brunei. Malaysia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Brunei have not reconciled among themselves. They do not present a common front to deal with China. Instead, each spends almost as much time fighting, not literally, but arguing with the other Southeast Asian nations as they do arguing with China. So the idea that the Southeast Asians will come together to counter China, it's a lovely concept. It fits international relations theory a la Europe, but it does not fit the historical war political realities of Southeast Asia. What about Northeast Asia? The two most important countries in Northeast Asia are Japan and South Korea. At the moment, They are actually talking to each other in respectful terms. They are engaging right now, I believe literally right now, there is a tripartite US, South Korea, Japan military exercise going on. The fact that this is news is important because it tells us how far we have yet to go. South Korean and Japanese military forces do not typically interact with each other. They most often interact with the United States. So it's US forces engaging with the Japanese and engaging with the South Koreans. But how often do South Korean and Japanese forces exercise together? Almost never. Basic intelligence sharing.
However, I would mention, and you're very aware of this particular point, the Russian and Chinese naval forces are cooperating, yes. do exercises together.
That is correct. And yet, South Korea and Japan do not. South Korea and Japan, in terms of information sharing, intelligence sharing, there is something called the GSOMIA. That is the sharing of the most basic intelligence information, and that had to go through years of negotiation and was sunk at least once due to electoral politics. The irony here being South Korea and Japan are both democracies, so therefore the will of the people has to be obeyed, and both of those countries view the other not on the friendliest or most respectful terms. At the moment, President Yoon in South Korea is trying to push ahead with improving ties, improving defense ties in particular with Japan. But there is no guarantee that his successor, whoever that might be, is going to continue that. His predecessor, President Moon, has openly lamented that there haven't been more openings to North Korea. And it was under his administration that the first triagisomia ran aground. So our view that, well, Asia will come together to face the China threat, I fear is perhaps the ultimate triumph of hope over experience. And particularly when we look at it in the longer term, come back after the South Koreans have had another presidential election. Does the successor decide he wants to maintain, or she wants to maintain, close security defense ties with Japan? If they do, then maybe we have seen a sea change, but I am not optimistic.
Well, the very fact that the United States and Japan have started working closely and actually conducting sea operations together, and they seem to be making some serious steps that would meet the needs of both nations if this should ever become a hot war. And the Japanese, as you well know, are constitutionally a Pacific power, not the Pacific Ocean, but peaceful and limited military means that's only supposed to protect their shores and people. But there's been a way found around that, so they're engaging in a serious military buildup. And the Chinese, as I learned from my few trips over there, they get very worried about the Japanese.
Oh, yes.
Because of the, obviously because of the history of what took place before World War II and during World War II. I remember being with some party leaders. It wasn't in Beijing, I don't think. But one of the first things they took me to was a memorial and actually showing pictures of the rape of Nanjing. And that's, when they talk about it, that's very fresh.
Oh, yes.
It's not something you'd soon forget when that kind of barbarity has been exercised over you. So they, what do you think about that, the fear that they feel toward Japan?
Oh, there is no question that, first off, this is not a Chinese Communist Party thing. There is a broad national distrust of Japan, and that would be true no matter who was in charge. Now, the CCP has played that up. The CCP has definitely exploited this. That being said, it is also important to remember that it predates World War II. The whole issue of Taiwan first arises from the results of the first Sino-Japanese War, 1894-95, when as a result of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, Taiwan is ceded to Japan. And that is actually the roots of the whole Taiwan problem. We have things like the Rape of Nanking. We have things like Unit 731, which conducted chemical and biological warfare experiments on Chinese people. But we also have national humiliation in the form of the first Sino-Japanese War, where the Chinese Navy of the time, which was arguably technologically comparable to the Japanese, was simply completely outmatched and defeated. And in fact, in Chinese military journals, you see references to the Jiawu War, well, what they termed the first Sino-Japanese War. And one comes away with the sense that there's almost a desire for a rematch. We want to show that, we who were once the students are now the masters. There is, I think, a combination of all of these factors when the Chinese look at Japan. A historic enemy, a historic barbaric adversary, a now ideologically aligned with the United States adversary, a country that was the number 2 economy in the world, which is no longer, displaced by China. So I think there are multiple different elements of how China perceives Japan as a threat, politically, economically, and militarily. And the realities of geography, that Okinawa in particular is a vital forward base for the United States. Unfortunately, a forward base that is completely within the envelope of all of China's most recent missile developments. The DF-21, the DF-17 hypersonics, as well as bombers and UAVs and all the rest. So I think the Chinese look at Japan as a very dangerous historic enemy, a very technologically sophisticated military, and someone whom they feel they may well have to confront for a variety of reasons.
Well, the respective size of their militaries is overwhelmingly in the favor of China. However, you mentioned the Senkaku Islands. Those haven't really been militarized. They're sometimes token troops sent there to demonstrate this is our island, not yours. But the location of the Senkakus, the location of Taiwan and Kimoimatsu, very well fortified, could possibly prevent the breakout of the Chinese Navy out of that first circle. And that's one element, I believe, and China's often proclaimed complaint that the United States is trying to surround us and isolate us.
So I do think it's important to note the Senkakus actually are totally unmilitarized. Chinese have landed people, but not troops, at various points and put up flags. Japanese individuals have landed over there and put up automated lighthouses. Again, as you said, both sides are basically making non-military measures to claim this is our territory. Both sides understand actually putting combat boots on the ground would radically alter the situation. So, but that being said, during the Cold War, one of the focal points, particularly on the maritime side, was the so-called Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap. If you look at a map, you look at where the main Soviet naval bases were, which was up in the north, Murmansk, Archangel. You look at the Greenland, Iceland, UK set of islands. Soviet submarines had to transit through that gap if they were going to interdict supply convoys between North America and Western Europe. It was absolutely vital that we hold Greenland, Iceland, the Faroes, the Shetlands, the Orkneys, as well as obviously the UK. And if we failed to do so, Tom Clancy in Red Storm Rising posited a Soviet invasion and seizure of Iceland, which tears open the gap, allowing Soviet submarines to flood the North Atlantic. If you look in the Pacific, you have something similar. It's called the First Island Chain. Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, the Philippines, on down to the Straits of Malacca. Whoever controls that island chain, if we control it, we limit the ability of the Chinese Navy to surge out into the Pacific. If they control one or more of the links, they can prevent that. Not only can they send their Navy out, but they can also then do a much better job of blocking and tackling any effort to hit China. And so what you have right now is Japan, a U.S. ally, Taiwan, supported by the United States, the Philippines, a U.S. ally. This is one of the reasons I do believe that the Chinese are interested in Taiwan, in addition to history, the century of humiliation, and microchips, because Taiwan's the largest manufacturer of advanced microchips. So all three of these are factors in, I think, Beijing's calculation of why do they care about this island of 23 million people?
We've talked about what is in that intersection of vital national security interests between China and Russia. That's the foundation for this bromance. What do you see in the long-term interests of these two countries that would conflict with the relationship they have right now?
There are, interestingly, territorial questions. China keeps saying it wants to be a member of the Arctic Council. The only countries that can be full members of the Arctic Council have to have territory north of the Arctic Circle. China notably does not. However, what is now the Russian Far East and Maritime provinces is comprised in part of territory that was claimed by Imperial Russia in the 17 and 1800s from a weakened China. And while the agreement signed between Deng Xiaoping and Mikhail Gorbachev resolved those territorial issues, what we see elsewhere is that with the Chinese, territorial issues that aren't resolved in their favor are in hibernation. They are not actually resolved. So an interesting question is, sometime in the future, could this become a focus? Again, that's very long term. I don't see this becoming an issue anytime in the next decade or so. The real issue is going to be who succeeds Vladimir Putin and who succeeds Xi Jinping. Vladimir Putin has the very dangerous habit of riding Siberian tigers and doing things like that that are not necessarily what an insurance actuary would recommend for longevity. So he's also, it's not clear how healthy he is, and he is an autocrat in a system that seems to have very poor quality control when it comes to Windows. So there's an interesting question: what would happen if Vladimir Putin died? Who would succeed him? He doesn't seem to have designated as a successor. The system is no longer communist, so there doesn't seem to be a structure of a presidium, a central committee, a politburo of people who would naturally at least form a convocation to succeed him. There was a very funny movie a couple of years ago called The Death of Stalin, which did in fact capture the reality of the massive chaos that occurred when Stalin died, and Beria, Khrushchev, Malenkov, Zhukov, and all the rest were engaging in very lethal machinations. The situation is different in China. While Xi Jinping is very firmly in charge, there is a structure in the form of the Politburo and Politburo Standing Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, who are major leaders. They seem to be pretty much appointed by Xi, but they do have some nominal authority in the event of his passing. The real question is going to be, how long will he stay in power? Right now he is going to stay in power certainly through 2027. Most of us assume he will stay in power through 2032. But at that point, he will also be in his late 70s, early 80s. He could die of a stroke. He could die of a heart attack. What happens at that point? Who will he have designated, if anyone? If he hasn't designated a successor, what is the situation going to look like in that chaos? So I think that is going to be in the short to midterm, the real determination of the fate of this bromance, as you put it, is what happens to Xi and to Putin, because it is not clear that this bromance will last beyond these two individuals.
Well, thinking of one item of irritation that might limit this bromance in the sense that it's a long-term strategic issue. You mentioned Russia's Far East and Siberia. Putin has expressed major worries about that area of Russia several times because it's greatly depopulated, it's deindustrialized, it's vacant, and has a kind of welcome sign posted to the Chinese, who are coming in greater numbers and working in Siberia. I don't know whether you'd call this an infiltration, but for some people say Putin is a political animal who doesn't think long term. He thinks of today and tomorrow and staying in power. He's not thinking decades ahead about what can happen, though he has expressed serious concern about the Far East and what's going to happen. And as you have pointed out, the non-Western nations who are much closer to that part of Russia than Russia is itself in terms of Moscow. I mean, I don't know what China has said officially, but they're interested. If Russia does fall apart, they want that for themselves.
Well, I think Central Asia is going to be very busy trying to simply keep itself afloat. Central Asia has the misfortunes of being landlocked and landlocked between Russia and China. So their survival is their foremost priority, I think, not acquiring more territory. But this is the broader issue of, does Putin think ahead and in what time frame? Consider the following. In order to invade Ukraine, he stripped the eastern military theater of most of its troops and equipment, and they have all gone off to fight in Ukraine. They're not coming back. If anything, they're probably staying in European Russia, being sort of reinforced and sent back into the line. Every new tank that is manufactured is being sent off to fight in Ukraine. It's not going off to equip, battalions in the Russian Far East. So if it's depopulated, it is now also underdefended. I think the Chinese are well aware that, if anything is going to initiate a nuclear retaliation, it is trying to take somebody's territory. So I don't think the Chinese are going to lightly think about invading Russia.
No, I wasn't suggesting it. It just seems by default it would become a Chinese area.
And the reality is that Vladivostok is far closer to Beijing than it is to Moscow. Moscow is not subsidizing the Russian Far East the way it was during the Soviet Union era. The only reason there were significant populations all along the Trans-Siberian Railway and the Baikal-Amur main line, which was the alternative route, is because the Soviet Union, Moscow, subsidized those towns and villages. Once those subsidies ended, the population left. So if you are the mayor of Khabarovsk, if you're the mayor of Vladivostok, and you want to improve your own personal situation and that of your citizens, you are looking to trade with Japan, with South Korea, with China. You are not looking to Moscow. That is going to create centrifugal forces in the longer term, where simply, as you say, the gravitational pull of Beijing and Shanghai and Tianjin and Tokyo and Seoul and Manila is going to have a significant impact. Is Vladimir Putin thinking about that? Frankly, I don't see much evidence of it, which is very worrisome, because if he wakes up one day and he finds not even open separatism, but simply sort of a drawing away, what is his response likely to be? He doesn't seem to be very subtle I mean, he can be at times, but this is likely to be the sort of thing that arouses a much stronger reaction, one that may well force Eastern politicians, Eastern Russian politicians, to then start making their own calculations. And down that is a very, very unknown path, because while the Soviet Union disintegrated, Russia largely stayed together. Although I should note here, I'm not a Russia specialist. But now what we are talking about is potential decoherence of Russia as opposed to the Soviet Union. And that, I think, creates a very distinct set of challenges. What is China's reaction likely to be? What is the rest of Asia's reaction likely to be? Remembering that Russia and Japan have fought wars over their own territorial disputes, which includes the northern territories and southern Sakhalin.
Well, with that thought about some long-range problems that will be faced in the future, we're out of time. And I would like to thank Dean Cheng, Senior Consultant on Chinese Affairs at the United States Peace Institute, for joining me today to discuss the mutual strategic interests that have brought China and Russia so closely together, and in the future what may disrupt the condominium that has been reached. I invite our listeners to go to the Westminster Institute website and see Dean Cheng's other programs that he's done with us over the course of the past 4 or 5 years. And of course, you will see many other offerings there of excellent programs on China, China-Japan, China-Taiwan, and such. So thank you for joining us today. I'm Robert Riley.